Welcome back everyone. As most of you know, the new Nintendo Switch actually just ended up coming out, aka the Nintendo Switch OLED, and we're going to go ahead and compare it against the Nintendo Switch Lite and see which specific Nintendo console you should go and pick up. Now this is what I'll tell you, if you have all the money in the world and you can get either one of these consoles, picking up the Nintendo Switch OLED model is probably the best thing you can do. It's going to future-proof yourself. I think Nintendo may end up dropping another new Nintendo Switch 2 within a couple of years from now, so there isn't really a huge reason to pick up an OLED model if you have a Switch Lite. But if you don't have either one of these, going up to the Nintendo Switch OLED model is one of the smarter things you can do in my opinion, at least for future-proofing yourself. But the Switch Lite is still a very, very good console, especially for a handheld mode console. If you don't plan on docking up your Nintendo Switch to a TV, the handheld mode of the Nintendo Switch Lite is still perfect. There are still some issues with the Switch Lite in my opinion, but when it comes down to it, that's a great console and it's at a pretty good price at $200 for the Switch Lite brand new. That is hard to compare against the $350 price tag for the OLED Switch. So again, when it comes down to it, if you have the money, go for the OLED Switch. Even if you are kind of figuring out which one's the better value per dollar, quite possibly the original Nintendo Switch is the better one, but the OLED model is definitely worth the money in my opinion if we're comparing these two consoles. However, if you currently have a Nintendo Switch Lite, you have to remember that this console can pretty much almost do every single thing that the OLED Nintendo Switch can do, except for TV mode. So if you don't plan on putting up your Nintendo Switch to a TV, then the Switch Lite is perfect. But if you think for a second that the Switch Lite, you don't plan on doing TV at all, but if you want to have that ability and all that, well, definitely the OLED model is the one you want to pick up, or even the original Nintendo Switch. Now on the front, there's quite a bit of a difference, The Nintendo Switch Lite had a 5.5-inch LCD panel, so it was a pretty decent panel. Surprisingly, I thought that panel looked a little bit better than at least the original Nintendo Switch, which was pretty weird. But the Nintendo Switch OLED model has a 7-inch OLED screen, so you're getting an inch and a half of extra display room, and it is quite a bit of a difference. It's almost in the same size as the original Nintendo Switch, but the Switch Lite is much better for smaller, if you're somebody who wants to throw something in a book bag and move on. Well, the Switch Lite not only is smaller, but there's a lot less moving parts with something like a Switch Lite compared to something like an OLED Switch. So definitely keep that in mind. So when we're looking at the displays, there's a massive difference. The OLED Switch definitely looks better, in my opinion, than the Switch Lite for a fact. Now on top of that, another big thing between these two is that the Switch Lite, the controllers and Joy-Cons are built into the console. With the OLED Switch, they are built out, so you can take them out, you can do all this other stuff with them, and you can replace them. This has been one massive issue for the Nintendo Switches, is Joy-Con drifting, and just so many issues with Joy-Cons. The bad thing about the Switch Lite is you can't really replace these Joy-Cons unless you know what you're doing. You can send it into Nintendo, they can fix it, but it is kind of one of those things that it's not if it happens to you, it's when it happens to you. I've had Joy-Cons that have drifted. I typically keep my devices in relatively good condition, and if it happens to me, it can really happen to anybody. The Switch OLED model has the ability, if it breaks, you can send it into Nintendo, they can fix it for free, or you can go and purchase new Joy-Cons, which is what Nintendo wants you to do, and you can go ahead and just throw them on your console and move on from there. So I definitely do think that has some capability. It's probably a little bit better overall, but I still think the Switch Lite is perfectly fine for everything else. Now you have the same microSD card slot, you have the same game cartridges. Really everything is pretty much exactly the same except for the actual docking capability. There is no docking capability for the Nintendo Switch Lite, but with the OLED Switch, not only can you go and connect it to an actual, TV, but on top of that, the new dock has an ability to essentially put in a wired, Ethernet cord if you want to. That is something I wasn't expecting Nintendo to do. I don't think they did it. Yeah, they didn't do it for the original Nintendo Switch. So now if you want, and you wanted a stronger connection and all that, you have that capability on the OLED Nintendo Switch, at least for that dock, than on the Switch Lite. So when it comes down to it, that is a massive, massive thing to keep in mind. Now, in terms of that pretty much covers up everything on the outside. There's also a little bit of a difference in the storage capability. The Nintendo Switch Lite has 32 gigabytes of storage built in versus the Nintendo Switch OLED, which has 64 gigabytes built in of storage. So right there, again, another little bit of a difference. You can store some more games with the built-in storage, but I don't really think that's in and of itself is worth the price, because you can just go get a micro SD card slot, put that into the Nintendo Switch Lite, and easily get way more storage than what the Switch OLED model comes pre-built in. So that's a big thing to keep in mind. Now another thing to also remember is that with the Nintendo Switch Lite and the OLED model, realistically, because they have the same chipsets, they have the same exact everything for the most part, they are going to be lasting around the same time in terms of games that are coming out, games that are releasing, any new games that are coming for Nintendo Switch, eShop, but also software updates. So you have to keep that in mind. These things are not different in terms of the chipsets. So in my opinion, I think they're going to last around the same time. Just because it's a newer console doesn't mean it's the latest and greatest of everything. Nintendo's still using that older chipset within all these consoles. So keep that in mind. But also that goes to say with the whole entire game selection, you can play the same amount of games on both of these consoles. So just because the Switch OLED came out, it doesn't mean that can play extra games than the Switch Lite can. That is not the case. Both of these things can play the exact same games. So if you want to get a Switch Lite and save some money and put that in towards, games that you're buying, that makes the most amount of sense to me. If you want to buy a Switch OLED model, don't expect to play any more games than the Switch Lite. Maybe Nintendo will do something in the future, I don't know, I doubt it. But that is pretty much the biggest difference is the body, On top of that, when it comes down to the performance, from what I've heard and from what I've done myself, it seems like the performance is pretty much the same on all these consoles. I don't think it's worse or better on the OLED model. I feel like the Switch Lite was actually pretty good. My original Switch was great, and this OLED model has been really good as well, but I don't think there's a difference in terms of performance between these. So that's another big thing to keep in mind. But also, really the main difference that I can think of, besides the body in and of itself, that you're getting with the Nintendo Switch OLED model is better battery life. So with the Switch Lite, you get, Nintendo estimates that you can get 3 to 7 hours of battery life from the Nintendo Switch Lite versus the 4.5 to 9 hours of battery life from the OLED model. Now it can be a little bit worse, it can be a little bit better because of the games that you're going to play and all that. So they estimated these things from The Legend of Zelda. But here's the thing, with these consoles, you really have to remember that you're going to be docking this console most of the time if you're using an OLED model. With the Nintendo Switch Lite, you are really only, doing it in portable mode. So you don't even have the ability of docking it up to a TV. So when it comes down to that, I would definitely say the OLED model is the much better option here. But with the Switch Lite, it's still not bad either. And for, being much cheaper than the OLED Switch, I don't really think it's that bad of a trade-off, to be honest, So in terms of that covers it up here. And to be honest, and to kind of sum up this whole entire comparison, I will definitely tell you, I think the Nintendo Switch Lite is a good console. I don't think it's a great value per dollar right now, but I just think the Nintendo Switch OLED model is worth more of that money than the Switch Lite. Even though the Switch Lite is cheaper, because you're getting that OLED screen, you're getting the ability of docking it up to a TV, you're getting the ability of adding up all these other Joy-Cons and playing them there too, and better battery life, just better display. I really think the OLED model is worth the extra money. But if you're on a budget, or if you currently own a Nintendo Switch Lite, I would almost recommend you to keep it. Mostly because the new Nintendo Switches could be right around the corner. I don't think they're a year behind. I don't think they're coming out next year. I hope they do. It's probably going to be within 2 to 3 years, but I still think that's perfectly fine for a Switch Lite. If you play with your Nintendo Switch Lite all the time, I would recommend keeping it. I don't think it's worth going to an OLED model if you really love the Switch Lite, but if you are already planning on switching over to the original Nintendo Switch, I would recommend just going over to the OLED Switch. It's $50 more than that one, but it's definitely worth the extra money in my opinion. So in terms of that covers it up there. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section as well. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.